What's up, everybody? I am here with Hano, and we are here just to have a really open-ended discussion about our interests. Could be meta-ethics, could be other stuff. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, all that.
Hi, Lance. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I'm Hanno. I am a philosopher and a writer. I'm from Germany. I'm in Germany right now in my hometown of Düsseldorf, close to the Dutch border. Indeed, I work in the Netherlands at Utrecht University, very nice university and a very nice town. And my interests are in basically understanding what morality is and where our norms and values come from. I guess you could call that meta ethics. I like to also be at least somewhat informed about the empirical side of things, any kind of study or theory from psychology or political science or economics or anything that could be relevant to study. In the end, meta-ethical questions and figuring out what morality and norms and so on, what they are about, what they consist in, whether they're part of the fabric of the world, that sort of stuff. I wrote a book recently that came out in September. It's called The Invention of Good and Evil, A World History of Morality. That's kind of like an update to the project of genealogy of morality, and I think that's what perhaps got your attention. And I'm curious to hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, it just sounds amazing. Like, I wish more people were doing philosophy. Like, I do a lot of meta philosophy stuff, and I complain about how people do philosophy. And one of my big complaints is that people do moral philosophy, which is, the main area I work in, is that I think empirical considerations are relevant, and they're relevant in all sorts of really fascinating ways that enrich the way that we approach philosophy. And part of my struggles with that is that many people that do philosophy see people from the outside that take an empirical approach, or even people with on the inside doing philosophy that take an empirical approach and say empirical findings are relevant. They see it as often naive, that, like, for instance, like, the limit experiments show that we don't have free will, that sort of stuff. And there is a kind of naive and unhelpful way of deploying
Yeah.
scientific findings or empirical findings more generally to sort of quash philosophical questions or dismiss them in ways that are not warranted. And people see that. And then when they see that I take an empirical approach, I think they worry I'm one of those people. And I take it I'm not, you're not, and that there are fruitful ways of employing empirical findings. Have you encountered this yourself?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think in '92 or something, there was this like gigantic paper that Railton and Darwell and Gebert wrote toward von Siècle ethics, sort of like a resume of 20th century ethics, where they also had a section on meta ethics and on the empirical relevance, on the relevance of empirical studies to meta ethics. And they had this beautiful phrase where they said, for the longest time, people have been sort of content to invent their psychology from scratch, and that's no good. And I think they are right about that. And then you get this sort of like overcorrection phenomenon that you just described, is where you have sort of the pioneers, as it were, the first people who try to address, for instance, the free will question by looking at experiments. And they overcorrect in that they become overly reliant on and sort of almost gullible towards these experiments. And they say, well, Libet has shown it's not real, right? But if you just look at these experiments for a very, very short time, you see they're interesting, right? They do something, but they couldn't possibly show that. And there are all kinds of assumptions that go into the experiments, even the most recent updates by Don Dylan Haynes or something. So you have that overcorrection, and it just takes a couple of pendulum swings, I think, for the people who for the community to realize, yeah, empirical input is important and it's interesting and it's inspiring and stimulating, and you need it. But also, you cannot ever take these studies purely at face value, right? Sometimes the methodology is messed up. Sometimes the conclusions are completely overblown. Sometimes it's just what they say they investigate is not what is in fact being investigated. Sometimes the philosophical implications don't follow, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So I'm very much an advocate of this empirical approach, but I think that kind of critical habit, critical attitude towards that had to be cultivated first. And likewise, you sometimes have psychologists who just completely dismiss these conceptual philosophical questions, and sometimes you have psychologists who are intimidated by these distinctions. And I think again, neither is the right attitude to have. You can learn something from the philosophical toolkit, but at the same time, you don't have to be, all I don't know. Don't have to be all, yeah, overly impressed by it and sort of bend your knee to it. And I think over the past years in experimental philosophy, which I know you're also interested in whatever empirical philosophy is, I think there's been a relatively healthy exchange and relatively healthy dialogue that I've enjoyed.
Yeah, so have I. It does seem like experimental philosophy tempered itself. I was just not even a student in the earliest days, and then I kind of became a student and started paying attention to it in the 2015, 2012, back about 15 years ago. And by that time, I already had the impression it was starting to mature because some of those early papers are like, we found this result, and so this refutes this presumption. Hey, we've shown, get your problems. People don't think about them the same way. Like a lot of it, it looked to me to overstate what one could conclude from individual findings, and that tendency for experimental philosophers to think that they were dealing death blows has
Yeah.
declined over the years. Do you have that impression as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think even Nobe's intentional action paper from like 2003 or something, it's like 2 pages long, and it says like 88% of people say this thing. We asked them in a park, and that's it. It's hilarious. It's very simple. I mean, it's interesting, but it's just very simple, and huge conclusions are supposed to follow from like asking a bunch of people in a park, and you get interesting asymmetries in people's judgments or intuitions or whatever. And stuff is, of course, much more mature and sophisticated and elaborate now. So that's good. That's good. And that's only been experimental philosophy. You also had sort of in parallel this empirical meta-ethics trend where you had Joshua Green, Jonathan Haidt, these sorts of people weighing in on old philosophical debates. Is moral judgment based in reason or not, or emotion or not, or deontology, consequentialism, so on and so on. So not really meta-ethics, but sort of more like a psychological evaluation of tensions between normative theories, and it's I think it's much more sophisticated and interesting now. Even though I haven't followed experimental philosophy that intensively for the past couple of years, but I still think it's good. I'm just focusing on different things now.
Oh yeah, the past couple of years, since I finished the dissertation a couple years ago, I haven't looked that much at what's developed since then. Relevant to my work. I've seen papers pop up here and there, but yeah, the green stuff that was like all the rage back when I was in grad school in philosophy, which is around 2012. And then Moral Tribes came out. I actually saw Green give a talk on this. I thought it was great. I was really excited about the stuff. I haven't heard much about it since then. It seems like dual process models. Maybe I'm just not part of those discussions, or I'm not in the right kind of department. I don't see it talked about quite as much. Do you have that impression, and do you know what happened?
Yeah. I have exactly the same impression. I mean, it's overdetermined in my case because I kind of moved on from that topic, not because I think it's uninteresting or bad, but just because I started doing other things. I stayed for quite a while. I stayed in sort of like evolutionary debunking debate, which is very much adjacent, not even adjacent. It's one that Green was also very active in, right? Singer and so on, where they were trying to debunk the deontological normative intuitions as they're kind of like up close and personal. People get emotional, and so on and so on, and that's why they think that way. And we can sort of the idea was we can debunk that by showing, that's like how a feeble animal would feel, right? But it's not thought through kind of as a reaction. So consequentialism fares better in that regard. But it is my impression also that people don't talk about it as much, or not maybe not even. Maybe not at all. I mean, it depends a little bit on where you're looking. It could be that some places arrive at certain discussions somewhat later. For instance, I sometimes think Germany, Italy, they're sort of like 5, 10, 15 years behind, and sort of like renegotiate these debates that have already, died down in the US or maybe even the Netherlands, where I work. I also think Green himself is not doing that stuff that much anymore. But I also thought at the time that There's this guy, Guy Kahane from Oxford. Surely know. And I think he just basically showed that it's false. I think he had a lot of like arguments against it, but also, sorry, also empirical evidence further corroborating these arguments that just showed, I think, pretty decisively that the green program is just dead in water. So there's the sort of whole idea that you can map these moral intuitions on a reliable process on the one hand and an unreliable process on the other, I think was kind of killed by that group of people, and Green stopped trying.
That's certainly my impression. Yeah. So I have to tell you, it's, you mentioned an interest in asking this question, like what morality is. I'm actually teaching a course called "What is Morality," and the whole course focuses specifically on the empirical literature that's intended to address that question. So there's a lot of like Mashery and Stitch stuff. We have some Green in there, and one of the things that we go over is they get a little exposure to the trolley problem as it manifested as a psychological paradigm, and then they get to the Kahn stuff, which I have the same impression. I read the Kahn papers. He has several of them, like Sidetracked by Trolleys and a few others, that I thought dealt fairly decisive death blows. And I rarely think that's the case for any given literature. I mean, I'm enthusiastic about people trying to revive old philosophical traditions. So, people pop up that are like, I want to promote positivism again, or ordinary language philosophy. I'm like, yeah, same thing with empirical paradigms. But the dual process model, I mean, it wasn't, so the stuff you mentioned was an issue. I saw that there was stuff with like the neuroscience wasn't as solid as it initially seemed like it was, like the fMRI data. And then you have like what Kant showed, like that it's just not, the trolley problem and related sacrificial dilemmas just didn't serve as good diagnostic tools for distinguishing people that had consistently utilitarian or consequential judgments from people that have more deontological judgments, because the people that push in the footbridge or that sacrifice don't donate to charity as much. They, if they score higher on psychopathy skills, they're basically just people with lower empathy that are a bit more likely to be a jerk. So a jerk is more likely to shove a person to save people. So it's not showing that the process is the way he operationalized it work. And I see that type of demonstrating that, hey, you have this paradigm that's supposed to sort people into box A and box B. It doesn't actually sort them properly, so the paradigm doesn't work. I suspect that this generalizes, because that's exactly what I did for my dissertation with another set of literature. And I think there's other areas. Have you seen the, I don't know if you look into this at all, Sitzma, Mashery, and a few others have worked on like the consciousness stuff?
I haven't seen it, but I'm curious to hear about it.
Yeah, so they've done work on showing whether or not non-philosophers have a concept of qualia or phenomenal consciousness, and whether they distinguish moral judgments in the same way as philosophers do. They have some pretty interesting evidence that suggests that maybe they don't, but I think that there might be methodological concerns with that. And I haven't like published a paper on that, but I've seen other people push back. But one of the really telling ones was the personal identity literature. I don't know if you saw, there's a paper, Starvins and Bloom. It's this really short paper. It's like 2 pages, and it really raises problems. So basically, for a lot of those studies, they would say, imagine a person like gets hit in the head, or they take or in some way, there's some radical neurophysiological change in the person that causes them to change their moral values, or some other character, like it changes their favorite color. And I'm summarizing the gist of this type of research. I don't remember exact studies. You would then ask the person, like, is this a different person now? And people would say yes. And some of the studies just asked something along those lines, like if it's a different person. And this is taken at face value to indicate that they think that they are literally a different person. But of course, at least in English, I don't know how it works in other languages, I could say, oh, Frank is a different person now. That doesn't mean that Frank has literally changed his identity into an altogether different identity. It means that they've substantially changed. Like if a person's reformed themselves, they used to be a jerk and now they're a very kind person. Like the Grinch growing the heart. The Grinch is a different person. It doesn't mean literally a different person. It means radically changed. And so when you consider, hey, there's other interpretations of this sort of question, it's not so clear the question actually shows people's views about personal identity at all. And so you have this problem of when people design these studies, you have to be careful. You have to ask this question: how are your participants interpreting the questions?
Yeah. I mean, the same expression exists in other languages, in German, for instance, where you just mean it's a really important change, right? It's still Frank, right? But he's just no longer he's no longer an alcoholic, an abusive father or something like that. He's like reformed or something, right? But he's not. It's not like one person that's gone now and there's a new person or something. So I agree, and it's that's the, I mean that's the tricky thing in general with recruiting these empirical studies to address philosophical questions. I still think that's a good approach and an interesting approach, because it's not like simply sort of sitting down and consulting your intuitions is better. Right. So in some ways, experimental philosophy can be seen as a kind of more kind of lab controlled conceptual analysis, because in the end you are asking people what they are inclined to say about a case that you describe to them, right? And you can sort of manipulate the conditions really finely, and that's all good. And you see, it's very, very difficult to even find out how people understand a question, right? What to conclude from people agreeing with this statement or this statement or this statement, right? What did people really mean? Yeah, so a good example for this same phenomenon is the experimental philosophy of metaethics or empirical metaethics. And a couple of years ago, I taught this small seminar with like advanced students, and we read the main experimental x-phi metaethics papers, where you try to get at people's folk metaethics, of naive metaethics. And I came away convinced that there is no such thing, and people don't have coherent thoughts about it, and you cannot get them out of them. So whenever you try to sort of like design questions that would try to isolate people's metaethical commitments, people are confused, they don't understand the question. And once you introduce, and if you want to get a proper reply, you have to teach them metaethics, right? So then they're no longer so you have to introduce these distinctions. Yeah, well, here's what response dependent means, and blah blah blah. And it was just totally confusing, and I think it was just wasn't possible. So a lot of the I'm not saying it can't be done, but I just haven't seen it, none of it seemed at all convincing to me, or at all even to work. And so it's very tricky to design these studies in such a way that they allow us to draw interesting conclusions about moral theory, metaethics, free will, consciousness, and personal identity, and so on and so on.
All right, so this is going to be really interesting. Are you aware of what I ended up writing my dissertation on, or any of that? I don't know if you know about my work on this stuff.
I mean, I checked out your website. It says that you have some very, very definitive opinions on moral realism, which I found interesting. But I don't know exactly what your dissertation was on. But
all right, so yeah, I know I talk online a lot.
I suspect it's on something similar. Yeah.
It's on exactly this question, and I arrived at exactly the same conclusion. It's kind of remarkable. So the PhD I did is actually in psychology, and what the dissertation focused on was a evaluation of the empirical literature, experimental metaethics, basically.
Oh.
And what the main argument I make is none of these studies are valid. And the reason they're not valid is because not enough of the participants in the studies interpret the stimuli as intended. That's the main argument. And so what I actually do is I do basically meta studies. I did a bunch of studies on how the participants in the studies were interpreting the stimuli in the studies. So I got, you must know the Goodwin and Darley paper from 2008. It's like one of the most important papers. They gathered open response data. They actually asked the participants, why do you think the other person disagreed with you? And if you look at their paper, they reported 97% of people, something like that, some huge percentage, interpreted the agreement appropriately. When I recoded their data myself, and I also had a collaborator, David Moss, code the data with me, we got super low numbers. I forget the exact number but it's like less than half. And so this got me really interested in designing questions like, hey, so I ask questions like this. I give them the standard disagreement paradigm or stimuli from like a metaethics scale, like the Collier-Spruill scale. And then I ask them, what do you think this question's asking you? Or I have them answer the question the way they normally would, like with the Likert scale or whatever. And then I say, why did you give this answer? Or I give them a response. So I'll say, here's the question we asked somebody else. Here's the response to the question. What do you think that person's response means? And then, I have this concern. Maybe people think people just already know what terms like objective and relative are. So I ask people, what does it mean to say morality is objective? What does it mean to say abortion is morally wrong is relative? And I coded these. I had a couple other people. One person coded a couple of them, and then David Moss coded a lot of them. But I did most of the coding myself. So someone could say, hey, qualitative research, there's subjective bias here. But I found just outrageously low. I prefer to call them intended interpretation rates instead of misinterpretations, because misinterpretation implies that the participants are at fault, like that the participant is incompetent or whatever. But I don't think that at all. So like take a term like objective. Again, don't know how it functions in other languages, but if you ask a person like out in the street, what does it mean to say that a moral judgment is objective? Here, a response someone might give is, it was made without bias or prejudice. That's a good response. That is one of the meanings of objective. Why would they think, oh, it means it stands independent, so it's true independent of the goal standards or values of individuals or groups? Why would that occur to them? So yeah, I wrote the whole thing basically going through all the studies and showing, I don't think people interpret this as intended. And I remember I was at a conference where I said what you said. Someone's like, okay, so if all these studies are invalid, what do we do? And I'm like, quit? Like, we just go do something else. That I was being a little glib because I do think there's empirical work to be done here, but I don't know what you think. What I think we need to do, and what I recommend at the end, is that we stop assuming that the way non-philosophers think maps onto the categories and distinctions that philosophers employ. So if philosophers are compatibilists and incompatibilists about free will, non-philosophers have to fit into those categories, as if whatever theories philosophers come up with are reflected in the cognition of ordinary people. Rather, we could just do bottom-up research. Like, how do you think about agency and moral responsibility without making assumptions that they have to fit our, philosophers' preconceptions? So that's what I end up advocating.
I think both can happen. So one thing is that philosophers sort of pretend that the distinctions that they came up with, they would have to be found in non-philosophers' minds as well, right? And there's, like you said, there's no guarantee for that. Sometimes the distinctions that we draw are no good, right? Or they are hollow or not useful, right? Not always, but sometimes. But I do think there's also the second case where these study participants, they just don't get it, right? So, for instance, I think there was maybe I'm being a little bit unfair, but it sort of like goes in the right direction. I think where people had sort of the stimuli were something like abortion is wrong is true, and people had to agree or not agree with that, right? But of course, there's this sort of like distinction between is abortion is wrong the kind of statement that is even like truth apt to begin with, sort of like the meta, I think the second order question, or whether people agree that abortion is wrong, right? But you could, of course, as you know, you could imagine sort of like a complete emotivist saying, yeah, I think abortion is wrong. I just think that's an expression of my emotions, right? I just don't think that's like a statement of fact. And I think that's a real distinction, right? So hooray is not a truth apt statement. And people just don't get it, right? So, it's interesting that you say that you did your dissertation on this. Now I'm thinking this sounds so close to the seminar that I did that maybe we even read. Like I would have to look up the syllabus. Maybe we even read your stuff. I don't know. It sounds very similar.
I had one paper. I think it came out. I can't remember the years anymore. In 2020, called "Misunderstanding Metaethics" with David Moss. It's a fairly short paper where we kind of give some preliminary overview of some of this stuff, but I ended up doing a lot more work after that.
Yeah. But there's also, I mean, free will, you have the same thing where people just sort of think that, it's very, very difficult to even figure out what kind of question to ask when you ask people about their notion of free will, right? Is it this spooky thing that starts stuff out of nowhere, or is it just like no one's forcing you? Or what's the concept that people have? Very, very difficult to figure out.
Yeah, it is. And one of the more obvious issues with that is that what free will is the central dispute around free will. Not simply whether we have it, but were we to have free will, what would its nature be? And given that, I think it's really weird that people adapted measures like as if they were doing standard social scientific surveys using free will measures. So what is it that they're measuring? Are they measuring a libertarian conception of free will, or are they measuring a compatibilist conception of free will? And if they are measuring a compatibilist one, which one? Because there's different ones, and the way you would operationalize those. So in other words, if you wanted to measure if a person believes in this conception of free will versus that conception of free will, you would ask a different question. So how can you use questions to measure belief in free will when the whole dispute is what free will is? And so I think that it got off to the wrong start from the outset by researchers failing to adequately recognize that they would need to disambiguate different senses of free will and measure them separately, and they don't do that.
Yeah. I mean, it's in general. I mean, it's not a watertight rule, but I tend to become skeptical when people define certain things out of existence, right? So when you give me a definition of what you mean by free will, and then according to you, it turns out that thing is not in the world, right? It's sort of like the concept is empty. I tend to be a little bit suspicious and think probably free will is not a concept that's just completely empty. It just like means something different, right? So surely there's some sort of difference in the way that humans make decisions compared to dogs, right? When you decide for this insurance policy or that one, even if the whole universe is, causally closed and stuff like that, there's some difference there, right? And whatever that difference is, I'm going to call that free will, for instance, right? I'm going to call that like, you made up your mind, you thought about it for 3 weeks, you read the insurance policy, you looked at your house and your finances and your wishes and maybe your risk tolerance and so on, and you pick one. That kind of decision process, even if it were fully determined, it would still be kind of different from a rock falling down, right? And so that seems to me what we mean by, I guess, free will, right? But I don't know if that's, I don't know whether the sort of like the determinism question is even comes in at all. I'm not sure whether that would like change anything about how I think about these distinctions between how a person chooses an insurance policy and a dog just does things, right? So maybe I'm wrong about all of what I just said. What I just mean is that we use the term free will in a sort of like everyday language game, and it kind of works fine, I suppose, right? And so when a philosopher comes along and says, "Look, here is what free will means," and it turns out it doesn't even exist ever or anywhere, that makes me suspicious, and I think like they're probably just missing the way that people use this term.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable suspicion. I might take a slightly different approach because sometimes I want to peel back the layers further, and I might want to ask, okay, well, do people use the concept of free will in everyday, interactions? And if so,
maybe not. Yeah,
is that culturally localized? I don't know if you saw there was some attempts to translate some of the free will skills, like the free will inventory and the FAD plus. I don't know if people aren't going to know the names of these. I abbreviated all of them. I'm used to the abbreviations because I wrote a lot about them. They tried to translate these into other languages, and in a few instances, people from the other cultures reported back like, this is not easy to translate in a way where the participants in the studies know what we're asking them.
Yeah.
And there's a couple instances where that's just like straight up, it's like in the paper. They're like, this isn't a local concept. The people don't know what we're asking them.
Yeah.
And
I mean, but I'm happy to admit that free will comes up rarely in conversation, but I think these questions, they do come up. I just read like last week, I think there was this long article about Neil Gaiman. Did you read that? It's like I think I didn't even know about him. He's like apparently a very famous comic book author and a renowned author, and with a big fan base. And it was kind of like sexual assault, rape allegations, pretty plausible ones. It seemed to me, or at least the stories as they were told, they didn't seem to be like completely made up by a lunatic. So it's something there. But you have sort of like a famous wealthy, powerful man with fans, and they live with him and so on and so on. And people start talking about how did people decide to engage in sexual intercourse. So the whole consent discussion, people quickly arrive at these questions. Was it free? No, it was coerced. No, it was pressure. No, it's power asymmetrical. And the other side says, no, you're an adult. You know, you knew what you would do, and so on and so on and so on. So I do think I'm not taking no stance on this particular story because I don't know. But I think that when there are controversial cases, could be anything, we quickly brush up on these kinds of very deep metaphysical questions, right?
Yeah, that absolutely, I totally can see that point, because this happens in legal contexts all the time. A person was on drugs, and they did something bad. Well, what if what if they were drugged against their will and then they did something? You know, or you have like the cases of people taking medications that had unexpected side effects. There's what Ambien or one that would make people do, like they'd wake up at night and do wild things. Then you have what else? Brain tumors. If a person has a brain tumor pressing against their amygdala or something, and then they go out and they do some violent action, what do we do with that person? So yeah, I do think people address these questions, and I do think that there's the question in philosophy about free will. There's a cluster of practically relevant everyday questions that free will is roughly adjacent to or concerned with that are everyday concerns. I do get worried when philosophers want to import what strikes me as superfluous metaphysics into the picture. And determinism is one of those cases. I don't think most people are determinists. I don't think they think about determinism. If you ask them in the studies, that's one of the things they tend to reject pretty readily. Like, I don't even believe that determinism is true. But it'd be really weird for people to go around having views about like these practical questions. Like, what do we do with, how do we distinguish between a person that's we're going to hold accountable and throw them in prison versus a person we're going to put in like psychiatric care versus a person we're going to let walk free? How do we make those distinctions? Oh, we need to figure out whether causal determination is true. Determinism is true. That's ridiculous. People don't do that. They don't care about that. So whatever it is that those practices they're doing, I don't think are about the question of determinism. And so, yeah, that it always struck me as weird that studies would frame things in this way, and that to the extent philosophers are preoccupied with those concerns, they would think that non-philosophers are implicitly driven by that. And one of the reasons why is just, I don't think everyday concepts are like center on counterfactuals. Like, if it were the case that determinism were true, how would I go? People just, if they don't think it's the case, why would that be an important feature of the concept?
Yeah. I mean, it's analogous to skepticism, right? So I think you can get people to agree that they are not able to rule out a perfect simulation, right? Why? How would they do that, right? Like it could be like a perfectly convincing dream, and you can get people to agree that they're not able to rule out that they are in a perfectly convincing dream, but it leaves their knowledge claims completely unaffected, right? So likewise, even if you could convince people that they could be living in a completely deterministic world and there's only one possible future, it would not change how they think about other people and their own actions and so on and so on. It just doesn't enter into their knowledge of free will ascriptions as relevant, right? I don't have to be able to rule out that I'm not dreaming in order to know that I'm now in this room and not in the other one, right? It just doesn't bear on it, right? It's an interesting question why that doesn't seem to be the case, right? Why people are unimpressed by that, including myself, right? I know all these skeptical scenarios, but none of them bother me, right? It's like David Hume. You go back to the backgammon table and you forget about it, right? And that's how it works. And it's an interesting philosophical question in its own right. Why these fancy, outlandish scenarios don't really do anything to your actual knowledge, self-ascriptions or ascriptions to other people, because there are scenarios that are like that, right? So if I do bring up, actually, that guy's identical twin is also in town, are you sure it was him that you saw? I would say, I don't know anymore, right? It's even though it's, in some way, it's just like me saying there's like a perfectly convincing imitation of that person that you saw, right? That you couldn't distinguish from the person that you think you saw, and yet I would totally say then I have no idea. It's 50-50, right? I'm sure I sell one of them, right? But I don't know which one. Yeah, it's that's why also philosophy, I think, is such a matter of temperament. It's like you need to find these questions interesting. Like I like this Wittgenstein quote where it's like a paragraph in, I guess, in Uncertainty, where he says like, yeah, no, I'm sitting on a bench in the park with a friend, and I say something like, I know that's a tree, right? And there is a third person, like a pedestrian, walking by and giving them a funny look, and then Wittgenstein says, I explain to the person, no, we're not crazy, we're just doing philosophy, right? Because it's a weird thing to say, I know that's a tree, right? That's what a lunatic would say, right? It's sort of like if you're just like high as a kite and you think, okay, I know that I'm not flying, right? You sort of like crazy talk. And that's what you need to have a taste for. And I think, I guess people like us are sort of like unusually fascinated by something that may border on crazy.
Yeah, that it's interesting you bring up this idea of temperament. Are you thinking of the temperament between people that are supposed to do philosophies versus people that are not?
Yeah, I think so. I find that you cannot talk people into it. It's like you catch it, right?
Yeah.
It's people always have the same story. It's like I read something somewhere, right? I found a book in my parents' library, or a friend told me about Derrida, or it's always just like a spontaneous epiphany style thing, and people catch it. Like you would explain how you got tetanus or something, right? Well, I was doing, the weeds, and I got cut, and now I have tetanus, right? And that's how people explain why they are philosophers. It's usually like, I caught it, right? And now I'm doing this. I'm a grown adult and a family father, and I'm doing this dumb shit. And right, and I cannot stop because I find it so interesting.
It does. I don't know if you've seen interviews with Rush Paper Landau, but he talks about this. So I think he said he was working in a restaurant, and like the chef or the cook in the kitchen was like handing him books, and he started reading them. He's like, I gotta do this. But
yeah,
I've heard that same story so many times that people are like, I read this thing, like this quote from Hume, and I was like, I'm in.
Yeah.
There's something suspiciously similar to religious conversion for me. Do you know if anyone's done like because I recently was asking around about this and people were referencing, hey, are people that do sociology of philosophy. Do you know if anyone has done like a deep dive into how people become because like I totally am on board with this account that you're describing because I've encountered this so many times. But this is anecdotes, do we have data on this? Do you know?
No, I don't know about it. I recently read it's a fascinating book that I had known about for years, but I never read it, and it's great. I think I read it because it was like reviewed in Scott Alexander's blog. If you know about like Astral Codex 10, and I think they have these book review contests. So not by Scott Alexander, but one of the good entries, The Rise of Christianity, which is sort of like a sociological study of why did Christianity spread in what is basically a hostile culture like Roman Empire, right? Why did it develop from this total weirdo freak cult into the dominant religion within 300 years? And it's a great book. I can't evaluate the content really, but it's very interesting approach. And they go into conversion, and I think religious conversion, the evidence suggests in this book that it almost always works best or exclusively with close relatives, and then you can sort of convert them. It seems to me different with philosophy, where philosophy is often something that you're the only one in your family that is interested, right? And it's usually like an outside influence. Again, this story with the book, or you talk to someone, and you just get fascinated by it, and it's And it was the same with me. And in fact, I haven't been able to stop. I don't want to stop. I still find it interesting, and I'm curious about these questions. And I'm not running out of ideas. But it's similar to conversion in that it's so instantaneous sometimes and inexplicable sometimes, and you sometimes can't, or often you can't explain it to other people. But I think I suppose if the evidence is correct that conversion is often a more social phenomenon, and philosophy is in fact almost like an antisocial phenomenon, right? It alienates you from other people, and all of a sudden you're interested in these questions. And I remember that for a long time. I mean, maybe I got interested in philosophy when I was 14 years old or something, and I think it's easily been 10 or 15 years that I try to talk about it as if it were possible to make it interesting to other people. Like you're at a party, right? People ask you what you're doing. At first, you are just, in school, and you talk about, I'm interested in philosophy. Then you're a student of philosophy. Maybe you're working on your thesis. Maybe you're working on your PhD thesis. Maybe then you are a young assistant professor, whatever. And at a certain point, I just stopped trying, and I just sort of like, don't try to get people interested, because it was so frustrating to me, right? I remember when people ask me, well, what do you do with philosophy? What is that even? I try to make it, explain it to them, make it interesting to them, and it never worked. Now, it could be my fault, right? But I just stopped doing it, because if you don't get it, you don't get it. And also, I think it seems to me that it's something that people convert to, if that's the right term, young, right? It rarely happens that you rarely hear a story where people have never been into philosophy, and then they tell you something like, but then when I was 39, I picked up this book and I got really into it. I think it's you build up immunity over your life. You have to catch it early, or you're never going to catch it. Right, a little bit like mathematics, perhaps, but the radical conversions that you see in people they tend to be religious, right? I found Jesus. You can hear a 50-year-old man say that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But there's
It can be very old, and it still happens.
But there's no 50-year-old man that says, oh, I found this book by Plato and I got hooked. It seems very rare.
These are really interesting differences. I think this all just sounds right. So I think there's some elements where it's similar to religion, but I think it's great you're pointing out, like, yeah, it's not like it in these other respects, and that does seem right. So speaking like for myself, I didn't have like a sudden conversion thing, but that's probably because I caught it so young, like caught the philosophy book so young. I don't remember catching it. I remember being very young. I have a brother that's much older. He was in college when I was like 8 or 9. And so I remember talking with it, like, I don't know, it's like his roommates or students from his college. Like, I was very young, and I was like, I'm sure I was saying nonsense, but I was trying to talk philosophy with them. And so, for me, it goes back so far. It was just like a feature of my personality. And, the other aspect of this is something that I have. It's inescapable for me. Like, it pops up everywhere I go. It's, for me, doing philosophy and taking a philosophical approach to things. It's not like a day job or a hobby that I turn on or off. There is a certain extent, like if I'm playing a video game, I'm not necessarily going like, are the characters in this video game sentient, and do they, like, I'm not doing philosophy then. I can turn it off, but it is such a feature of my disposition that, like, the kinds of humor that I use has a philosophical element to it. The kinds of conversations I have, sometimes it pops up. So it kind of just is there, and I couldn't get rid of it if I wanted to, in the way that I could with other things. So yeah, I do have that, but like all the insights you're sharing here, I haven't really discussed them much with people, but they all sound right, and it all sounds like it matters to me. And part of the reason for that is that if the people that are all doing philosophy, writing about it, publishing it, becoming prominent figures, are temperamentally very different from most of the people, let's say they only represent, because like, how many philosophers are there? A few tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 philosophers. It's like less than a fraction of a percentage of the world's population. If they're temperamentally very different from everybody else, they're not going to be in a great position to represent those other people when they say, here's how I think about knowledge, here's how I think about truth. They may just be too different.
I agree. I agree, and yeah, I completely agree about the. And I think I could feel it when like I said, when I caught it, I immediately thought, oh, I'm that person now, right? This is what I'm about, right? And I even sometimes get the impression, like I even resent professional philosophers where I harbor the suspicion that it's not like that for them. They were just good at it, right? But they could be doing something else, right? So sometimes you meet professional philosophers, but you think this guy could be in finance, right? And also just like this is like just an intelligent guy that just happened to be encouraged to go into philosophy academically. And I'm very suspicious of that when that passion isn't there, right? When I think like that person isn't infected, I think lesser of them as a philosopher. I want to see that insanity in people's eyes a little bit, right? And I also think that once you are down that yellow brick road, so to speak, and you've caught the philosophy bug, then people are usually able to reconstruct a style of thinking that they have encountered in themselves earlier, right? Then people say, oh, actually, even as a child, I was really obsessed when I was 6 years old, really obsessed with what was before time. Stuff like that, right? Just these types of questions. Or I remember as a young kid, I was really like, couldn't get my head around how things look when you look at them without your sense organs, right? You know what I mean? Like, how do things look when you don't use these particular instruments, right? And I thought, in primary school, but bees see it differently, right? That sort of stuff, and that fascinated me endlessly. And I talked to people like, have you ever thought about, and it was like, yeah, I mean, I was like 7, 8 years old or something, so people wouldn't tell me you sound like a stoner, but it was a bit that reaction. It's like, what are you talking about? This is insane. Of course, the people would say like, no, the world is the way I see it, and I found that so demoralizing because I thought, well, obviously it isn't, right? And you're just, but people wouldn't admit these kinds of thoughts into their thinking because maybe they are destabilizing. You get a kind of vertigo from it. But I found that so fascinating. And then when I caught philosophy, I thought, oh, that's the discipline where people talk about these questions all the time, and I'm in.
Yeah, that vertigo experience, I don't like having it at the time, but I appreciate it in hindsight. And something that preceded or happened around the time I got into philosophy. I was in college, and I've talked about this a few times on my channel. So I used to be all into every type of pseudoscientific conspiracy theory nonsense that you could possibly be into. I thought aliens were abducting people. I thought the moon was fake. So I thought crystal magic was real. All of it, just all of it. And are you familiar with James Randi, the magician?
I've heard of it, yeah. Back in the day, I think these like new atheist guys, they would cite him favorably, I think, as sort of like debunking magic or something.
Yeah. So his thing wasn't really the atheist stuff. He was I mean, he was really motivated to expose like charlatans and like fake faith healers, especially.
Yeah, like Uri Geller and stuff, right?
Yeah. He does the spoon bending and stuff.
Yeah.
So James Randi happened to live near me. He lived like a 20-minute drive from my house, and he was just giving a talk at my university, and I got talked into going. Someone said a psychic investigator is coming to the campus. I thought he was a guy that used psychic powers to investigate crime, so I was like, cool, and I went. And that was not at all what he was. He investigated the psychics, so I misunderstood, and it's the most fortuitous misunderstanding of my life. That was the biggest conversion moment for me. That was an experience of vertigo. I felt my worldview, the bottom dropped out of it in real time in the span of an hour. Like I'm like, oh, I am wrong about all of this. And not only am I wrong about all of this, but I'm wrong for a more fundamental reason, which is the way I'm thinking is fundamentally misguided. And I had to like rebuild an epistemology and everything from scratch. And I think I was 16 at the time. I just started college, and that's when the whole philosophy thing really kicked into high gear. and it's what got me into psychology, because part of my thinking was, I didn't think I was stupid, and I still don't think I'm stupid, and yet I had a bunch of ridiculous, like the kinds of beliefs a stupid person would have. So, how could I have ended up that way? Now, one explanation is maybe I'm just stupid, but I don't think so. Smart people can believe weird things, and I wanted to understand, like, how can people be led down the path of believing things that are not true? How can they have bad frameworks and worldviews? And I think that moment stuck with me. But what's interesting about it is that it wasn't fundamentally philosophical in a distinctively philosophical sense. It was philosophy and science at the same time. It was critical thinking, it was skepticism. It was like and maybe that stuck with me, that like because I've remained a sort of like hard-nosed empiricist. So that was something I want to ask you, because I think you've described really well this, like, the philosophy bug. Do you think there's like an analogous like a science bug or something like that people could have?
Yeah, I haven't heard stories about people becoming scientists that are like that. I think this kind of story I've heard dozens of times. Of course, it also just happens to be the group of people that I know. But this philosophical conversion I've heard more often, and the physicists or biologists, but a biologist would tell you, I was always fascinated by bees, right? And it just like, and then I just got into it, and now I'm torturing them to see how they behave. But I'm not sure that a science bug exists. I think there are some similar ones. I think probably so. I don't play chess, but I think chess can be like that, right?
Yeah.
Where it really clicks a lot, and then people are just so into it. And the only thing that can get people out of that is realizing that they're never going to be really good, right? That can make people lose interest, where they have this intense burning desire to play chess and do nothing else. But then you realize at a certain point that some people are just always going to be much better than you. And I think then some people sort of like say, oh, okay, I need more than one interest, right? Because I'm never going to be like top 10. But I didn't see it with science so much. But I was curious to hear from you, because you said like you were into conspiracies, whether you can explain why that was, because I don't think it's stupidity. In fact, I think it's like a very lazy narrative. Also, that people have been talking about, how can people be so gullible in politics and believe this or that. It's something else entirely, I think. But because these conspiracies that you've mentioned, they're all unrelated, right? So it can't be that one was really convincing to you. It seems more like you enjoyed it, or what do you think was it that?
I do think that was a big element to it. So the stuff that I was into is stuff like Eric von Däniken, Chariot of the Gods, like, the kind of stuff where like aliens built the pyramids, like all the stuff that what's on the History Channel or whatever, like the real goofy. I'm not talking like the government conspiracies. I'm talking like weird alien, like reptile alien stuff, like the weird ones. And also cryptozoology, Bigfoot, and all that stuff. It's hard to put myself in the mind space that I was in at the time. It was more than half my life ago at this point. It's more than 20 years ago. And when I try to think back, what was my framework or thinking at the time? It's very doubtful that I have a really accurate, sense of what I would have thought. But I definitely thought that the world was an exciting place. And I was drawn to these ideas because there was something deeply appealing about having secret knowledge, like esoteric knowledge. Like, I know the truth, but you don't. I've taken the Matrix red pill, not the other red pills. I've seen reality for what it really is. I'm out of Plato's caves, all the allegories. There's something appealing about feeling like you're part of like the anointed ones that know the truth. And that I think was a big part of it.
Yeah. So I'm curious because, like I said, I don't think it's about the stupid smart spectrum, but as it happens, I have never been into any conspiracy ever. I mean, some conspiracies happen, right? I mean, September 11 was a conspiracy by Islamic terrorists, right? It's so yeah, there was a conspiracy against Hitler to kill him. So conspiracies obviously are real, some, but I never had like a taste for these wilder ones, and I think it was because again, when I was very young, I think I talked to a kid and I kind of found out in conversation that he believed in Santa Claus, but for real. And I think that was like a friend, but no more after that. Like, I couldn't believe how one can be such a moron. Like, I don't know, 6 years old, right? I couldn't believe how one can be, how one can have so little self-respect and believe this nonsense, right? And that put me off anything like that forever, right? So every time anyone mentions, I think this could be aliens, I immediately, I'm taken back to the Santa Claus kid, and I think, you fucking moron. Just temperamentally, right? I'm just not made for it. Or I had this formative experience where I just think, like, it's not for me. It's not for me. If you show me one that's true, I'm gonna be fine, okay. But I think like just a year ago or two, they had these, like, we found aliens, and they had these like tiny kind of like skinny figurines in coffins or something. Do you remember that? And they showed them to the public.
Yeah, I've seen stuff like this, like the alleged bodies of like little aliens.
And I just cannot. I if you believe that kind of stuff, yeah, I don't know what to. It's just not for me. I don't have a taste for it. It's like some people will never get coriander or jazz, and I'll never get that.
You were fortunate. Yeah, I got two. You know, what's interesting about it is part of the reason my beliefs persisted for so long is because I didn't socialize much. I didn't talk to anybody. And, you know, this was basically when I went to this Randy talk, it was the first time I was exposed to a skeptical perspective that directly grappled with it. And I immediately was like, oh, I'm wrong. Like, I remember sitting in that audience. I remember the building I was in and where I was sitting. Like, it's like one of those like flashbulb memories. I don't even know how accurate these are. Probably.
Yeah. But it could also be a different outlet for the same kind of thing, where you thought, oh, here is a new and even better way for me to be smarter than the rest.
Maybe. Yeah. Maybe. I mean, there certainly is this
because I would see that in myself, right? It's like, I love being a smartass, and I think, like, oh yeah, this is really like distinguishes me from so that I can relate to that. Yeah.
And well, there's certainly an element of that, both to skepticism and I think more prominently atheism. There's often this smug, asshole, triumphal attitude that people do. Oh, you idiot believes in your sky daddy, and you know, I have that
a little bit. Yeah.
And I've mostly set it aside, but I do still have this impulse now when people believe in conspiracies to be immediately like, oh, the person's an idiot, and I don't want to talk to them. I do have that attitude. What was the other one? There was another one that oh, right. What I was going to mention, though, is in spite of this being many years behind me and now being very much on the, like, believing in photos of alien bodies is like, there's aliens, is ridiculous. Like, just ridiculous, beneath serious consideration. Not, again, though, I have the same attitude. Like, if you show me good evidence of aliens, we're not going to be like, no, nothing would convince me. I'll accept convincing evidence. You go bring Bigfoot in from the woods, I'll believe in Bigfoot. I'm not totally afraid to believe weird stuff. I just don't. But you know, I still have that feeling, like, you know, people, there's something that I find appealing about really ridiculous views. Like, you know, people go around talking about the earth being flat. Great. Now it's going to be some notification. Hey, the earth is round on my channel. There's something like fun about that idea. Like, what if there was such a magnificent conspiracy that the earth was flat? What an exciting world. Like, you know, why am I drawn to be like in the Truman Show and discover everything was alive? Like, it's almost like I have this weird desire that that's the case, and I have to try to suppress it because it's ridiculous and it's not helpful to think that way.
Yeah, it could also like tap into suppose there are individual differences in how much you enjoy outlandish counterfactual scenarios, right? So it's already fun to think, like, how would that be that the earth is flat but we don't realize it, or something like that? Like, and already, like, you say, oh, what are the 18 beliefs that I would have to adjust for that to make sense? And that's fun, right? It's sort of like working out the logical map of how this error could have occurred is fun. I like flat Earth because it's so there's no political agenda, I think, right? It's with flat Earthism, people don't think like it's the Jews that tricked us, right?
I don't know,
Yeah,
but
I don't know
since there
either.
are all these like comorbidities or correlations between endorsing some conspiracies than others, it
Yeah,
might be that they're disproportionately more likely to endorse other conspiracies, including ones like that.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't know. I haven't looked into it enough.
yeah. But it's an interesting, and I mean, again, I'm happy to be to look. I'm happy to look down on people. This is sort of like this assholism that you all see in new atheist circles. Okay, but also philosophy. There isn't there isn't. It's not that far from conspiratorial thinking, right? You sometimes have people who say stuff about very subtle mechanisms of dispositive power that create mental illness, right? Sort of like Foucault style thinking, right? There is a kind of conspiratorial attitude. It's like, hidden mechanisms cause important things in your life and don't want to be found out. And if only you figure out and you get rid of this ideology or this delusional misinformation context, then you will see, right? So that's not so far from conspiratorial style of thinking. And so, but I get why people would find that attractive. It just so happened that I personally, I think I'm just psychologically not that made for it. And also because, and it's a point that's not very original, but it's made frequently. I'm kind of a little bit misanthropic, so I don't think people are good at faking these things, right? The sort of usual competence point. It's sort of like, yeah, I don't think you can like blow up the World Trade Center and no one talks about it, right? Someone's gonna like mess up. It's these things are too difficult to orchestrate, and that already makes me. All these secrets are too important. Someone's gonna talk to the press. Someone's going to want to get famous, and I just don't think that. I think already most conspiracy theories kind of like fail that test, where I think that we're just not competent enough to pull it off.
People both couldn't adequately coordinate at the level of like. I mean, you look at the way countries are run, and it's like you really think all these conspiracies. Not only are they pulling it off, but they're pulling it off when the whole world would oppose them the moment anybody got caught wind of it. And then the other factor here is the social factor. Someone somewhere is going to see value in snitching. So, if the US really held aliens in Area 51, there would have been a credible person that came forward and said, I took some photos, here they are.
Yeah.
The alien.
Yeah. That's so as far as I know, it's not disputed that Israel planted these explosive devices in these pages. That's just a normal fact, right?
I don't know about that. I don't know.
Wasn't that like a couple of months ago, like in the same minute, 3:00 on the same day, like 6,000 pages exploded.
Oh, yeah, I heard
that.
About that. I never followed up on or looked into that. I've been out of the news loop for a couple of years, so I don't know.
Okay, so I'm not even sure, but I think that's not a cookie belief. I think that's just like a normal fact that the news knows about. You know what I mean? Like I think they just did that, right?
Okay.
Let's suppose, for the sake of the argument, they did. And I think they do. It's not like I mean, they didn't confirm it, but it seemed like a total mainstream thing that they did that. And very, very often the reaction people had to that was, that's impressive. Because it took like 10 years of planning. They had to like set up a firm that literally produces pages, right? 99% of them would be like normal pages that you sell to people, only to 10 years down the line sell like a couple thousand pages to a bunch of people that they had identified as Hamas related, to blow up in their faces and rip their ears off, right? And people and that is in a way a conspiracy, right? That a lot of coordination to achieve a particular goal in secret is a conspiracy, I think. And people said, wow, that's great. That's not great in the sense of I think this is good, but it's impressive that they pull it off, because it's so rare, I think, that and you need a certain type of like special agent kind of person that would keep that kind of secret and all sorts of mechanisms, and it's very rare, and I think that's why conspiracy theories tend to be so implausible. But again, philosophy is often not so far from that style of thinking, like a paranoid style of thinking. Like I could be wrong about everything, right?
Yeah, but you had mentioned counterfactual thinking. So you're not drawn to the conspiracy stuff, but are you drawn to like far-fetched counterfactuals? Do you find like with the utility monster, are those fun for you? Do you enjoy those, or is it just part of the tools?
Yeah,
Toolkit?
I like it's I enjoy them because it's this is very teachable stuff,
Hmm.
right? That's great. Um, but despite the fact that I find it interesting and enjoyable, I often think that we can learn relatively little from these scenarios the more outlandish they get, because it's kind of like our imagination just becomes unsteady or something.
Mhm.
Right? Um, for instance, I often think that because it's been so prominent in recent years with like the emergence of long-termism, for instance, right?
Yeah.
And long-termism emerged out of population ethics, right? Where you compare world A and world B, and in world A you have 10 billion people that are pretty well off, and in world B you have 100 gazillion people that are badly off, but not suicidal. Just about worth living. Um, the life they have is just about worth living. And already these kinds of scenarios, I don't really know that we can even properly think about them. Like we there's too little information in them. In some sense, there's too much information in them. Right? We have the stipulated knowledge we have about these scenarios is very, very certain, or stipulated to be certain, but it's very limited, right? We know like 3 things about this world, right? And we are supposed to compare it to this other world that we also know 3 things about. And I don't think our mind really works that way. I think it's we don't really assess these comparisons properly, which is why also you cannot get people to agree on, is the repugnant conclusion repugnant or not, and so on and so on. And so I enjoy these scenarios in epistemology and moral philosophy, but I don't think we're very good at really properly appreciating what these stories are supposed to be about, and it kind of makes thinking about them kind of dodgy and unreliable a bit, I think.
Do you think philosophers overuse or misuse thought experiments in their actual like articles and research and arguments?
I wouldn't know. Plausibly, they for a while they did, right? So I think, yeah, post-war, it seems like mainstream epistemology for a long time was just like you came up with a new example, right? Like the twin brother in town. I think there's like a guy got famous for that example and writing about it, right? Or fake barns, or whatever, Chinese rooms, all these thought experiments. And if you just found like a catchy one, you made a name for yourself, right? I don't think it's like that anymore. And now the hype is different now. Now you get famous when you, I mean, not anymore, but until recently, the thing was to like find out an epistemic emotion. I think it's like epistemic curiosity or something, or epistemic boredom or something, right? People would coin these terms like, epistemic something, and or epistemic insouciance, I think, wasn't it? Was a funny one. That's been a bit of a fad, and in recent years, it's not been so much about, I think, about thought experiments, but more about other styles, networks, social stuff. I think that's the current hot thing, is to do everything socially.
Yeah, that's it. That's an interesting thing you bring up, this fad notion. My interests have shifted towards kind of sociology of philosophy to some extent. Like that's not my only interest; it's just an interest. Because one of the things I wonder about is people will, and I see people do this on Twitter and elsewhere all the time, is they'll cite the 2020 Phil paper survey and they'll say, well, 71% of philosophers think this, so you better get in line with what the majority think. It's like, well, if we had asked this survey, 40 years ago, we might have gotten something very different than what we get now. And I'm not so confident that I see us converging on this, like the correct answer, nor do I think that they're just converging more generally. These look like, to me, views ebb and wane. They wax and wane in the world of philosophy, and I'm not sure what's driving those trends. The hardcore rationalist philosopher might think, look, we're all collectively moving towards collective reflective equilibrium, and we'll eventually all arrive at the right answers. Doesn't look like that to me. It looks more chaotic. It looks more stochastic. It looks more like there are all these sociological forces bouncing around that drive current trends, like evolutionary debunking arguments you mentioned earlier. They were like all the rage, and now I haven't seen a paper on these pop up in like a feed or something that I have for months, years. I don't even remember the last one that I read, but I have seen this trend towards like making everything some social thing. You mentioned like epistemic insert blank, and I'm like, yeah, I have seen papers where the new thing is coining these terms. What's going on? Like, this is a goofily general question, but what do you think is going on there? Like, what's up with all the facts?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is sociological. I think sometimes people just move on from a question because it seems stale, right? So the new riddle of induction or something, that wasn't solved, right? But no one writes about GRU anymore. You have sort of basically a kind of Kuhnian dynamic. It's research programs fade away out of boredom, or because the people die, the advocates die, right? And I think in philosophy, a lot of it is like that. Evolutionary debunking, often it's also like with evolutionary debunking, because that's a debate that I used to know quite well. Yeah, so it's always been around a little bit, but then I think there's the Street paper from 2006 or something, this extremely long paper in Phil Studies, and that really like formulated the what the issue is in a very clear way, right? And also brought to focus that debunking can be either first order or it can be meta-ethical, right? So it can be maybe it's moral realism that is being debunked rather than our moral convictions, right? So people talked about that a lot. Because philosophers are weird, and philosophers care about whether their favorite metaethics is true, right? Which literally like 500 people care about in the world. And no one else even knows what this question is about. And then sometimes I think with debunking, it sort of stops because, no new ground is to be gained. And all these distinctions become too fine. And it just seems like it's dying. Right? It just seems like the debate is no longer fresh. The low-hanging fruit have been picked by the people who happen to be at the height of their abilities when it's gained attention, and the latecomers are sort of you have this sort of like, there's this famous book by Everett Rogers on fashion cycles, where you have the pioneers and the early adopters and the early majority, the late majority, the laggards, and the sort of like, people who will never join. And you have these cycles in philosophy as well, right? There's a trend, people hop onto it. I was kind of like with evolutionary debunking, I guess I was in the early majority, right? I wasn't among the pioneers. I wasn't even among the early adopters, but when it sort of like gained momentum, I did something on it and it worked.
Cool. Yeah. Do you think people think the matter is settled? Like, what do you think that? Sorry, is there a consensus here? Like, if people like thought, EDAs don't really work, or do you have a lot of people that still think, they really raise problems, and other people are like, no, they really don't, and they still think that, and they've just moved on?
I think so. I think there are some people who still think that pointing out the origins of something has no relevance at all.
Yeah.
And there are some people who think that, no, it would be really unsettling to me if I found out that I love my kids because I want to protect my genes, right? Or I whatever, some sort of origin story that's not so noble sounding. And I don't think there's a consensus. It seems to be some people are very disturbed by these genealogies, and some people are unfazed. And of course, and also with every debate, you can always tell a debate is sort of like dying down a little bit when it turns meta, right? So in the debunking debate, you also had that where all of a sudden people started talking about, okay, what are we doing when we are doing debunking arguments, right? What are we? What am I accusing someone else of when I'm accusing them of? You only believe that because, I don't know, your prenatal or your infantile desire wants to make you believe that or something, right? So that's sort of like whenever you see that ascent into reflecting on the higher level on that thing, you know it's 5 years and then that's the end of it.
Yeah, I wonder if anyone's tracked trends like this, because that is, I also have an impression, which for me doesn't seem to be. I don't seem to be getting tired of the meta ethics stuff because I did meta studies on people doing research in experimental meta ethics, which already you have meta ethics. The people doing empirical research on it, you could call it meta ethics because they're doing research on how we think about meta ethics. And then I'm doing research on the research. So am I doing meta ethics? But I haven't got tired of it. There are still more studies coming out. So I guess there's going to be people that are still like a lot of these things that allegedly die out. There's still a few people that work on it. Like you could find a person that'll say that they're a logical positivist or they're an ordinary language philosopher.
Oh yeah,
yeah. So like Avner Boz is in the philosophy at Tufts where I went. He's been working on ordinary language stuff for quite a while, and bringing back a lot of the methodological concerns that ordinary language philosophy had towards analytic philosophy and updating it, bringing it into a contemporary context. So it's still around. So a lot of these things, they just become, they're not the big thing. Like I feel like back in the day, in the 90s and 2000s, like rock and metal were a little more popular. Like Metallica used to be like a household band name, but these days it seems like things have shifted a lot more towards I don't know, like pop. I don't know. Maybe pop was bigger. I don't know. I'm not a musician or a historian of music, but it seems like a lot of music that I grew up with, that I really love, is no longer super popular. But those artists are still putting out albums. I find them on Spotify. 2023, if you have a new album, it just, instead of getting 100 million listens or whatever, they get 12 million, and they're still there. So I'm going to keep working on the topics I work on.
Me too.
People are still working on Gettier problems probably somewhere.
Yeah, totally. I'm totally like, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Like I would never want to like tell people not to do something, but there are these larger trends that you can sort of sometimes identify retrospectively. And I think that also the sociology of philosophy is something that I don't do myself, but it's always interesting to talk about. Where people's blind spots and prejudices and unreconstructed assumptions come from. Like one of my favorite examples is the political philosopher G.A. Cohen.
Yeah.
So he wrote a lot about I'm paraphrasing very, very, very recklessly, but society should be more just and more equal and so on and so on. Basically defending socialism from objections and trying to sketch why that's attractive. So very big on, he wrote a paper that says, if you're an egalitarian, how come you're so rich, right? And there should be redistribution and no concentration of wealth and so on and so on and so on. And then he has this famous, very, very slim book, Why Not Socialism? It's sort of like, a camping trip wouldn't be attractive if you organize it on the basis of market principles, right? You haggle, there are prices and so on and so on. It's no fun, right? So, and he wanted to show with that socialism is inherently more morally attractive. But on the first page of that book, he says, I'm going to explain this camping trip thought experiment to you. I must admit, I'm myself not so much an outdoorsy type. I'm more for the comfortable warmth of All Souls College, Oxford. And it's so funny because he was talking about, equality and community and solidarity and redistribution of wealth, but cannot bring himself not to mention his highly distinguished and highly unequal position within the status hierarchy of the philosophy profession, right? So I think in many cases, so that's why I mentioned sociology of philosophy. It's often telling to look at what philosophers aren't talking about, right? Because philosophers are probably, in many cases, people that could make more money outside of philosophy, right? Because they tend to be pretty smart. So they sort of self-select. So philosophy is basically a bunch of people that self-selected away from money and in the direction of intense prestige hierarchies, right? With department rankings and everyone knows it's, I don't know, NYU, Rutgers, Pittsburgh, Princeton, and so on and so on. Everyone knows it's Phil Review, Mind, PPR, blah, 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 right? Everyone knows these things. But philosophers don't talk very much about the pernicious effects of status hierarchies, right? They always want to redistribute money because that's what they're not interested in, right? As evidenced by the fact that they chose a profession where not that much money is to be made. And I think that's also an interesting topic for sociology of philosophy is what are the kinds of people that do philosophy and how does that shape their interests, right? Because there is a kind of equality that apparently G.A. Cohen wasn't interested in. He would not have wanted to be mistaken for someone from this sort of like no-name university in Eastern Europe or flyover America, right? He made very sure that you knew that he is a member of the most prestigious college in the world, right? So there is a kind of inequality that was very important to him, right? It's just that it wasn't about money, and so he didn't see it, sort of.
Yeah, wow, that is really interesting. This relates to another interest that I've had for a long time. I put it on the back burner, but I'm really concerned about where things have gone with the rise of, I guess I've seen someone call it mandatory pre-publication peer review. I think it was Adam Mastriani on of Experimental History. Don't know if you know who he is. He has an amazing blog.
What is that? I don't know what. I've never heard of that.
Oh, okay. So his blog is Experimental History. It's actually a psychology blog. That's awesome and worth checking out. But he talks about peer review there, and what he's talking about is peer review in some form has been around in the academic world for centuries. You send a letter in, and then it's discussed among your colleagues or whatever. That's your peers reviewing you. But the current system we have in place is one in which status, career advancement, prestige, and even formal requirements for keeping your job all center on publishing in academic journals. And those academic journals have only recently, I just was reading an interview with someone that's a historian of peer review. Journals were not requiring peer review up until the 1960s, the 1970s. It was only in the 80s and 90s when this stuff really became cemented. Like after I was born in some cases, and many other people, perhaps. Maybe I'm a bit late because I'm 86, but it's fairly recent that there's this distinction we make between peer-reviewed work and non-peer-reviewed work. The peer-reviewed work, that's the good stuff. The non-peer-reviewed stuff, maybe you want to, maybe you want to take that with a grain of salt. But that whole system entrenched itself in one or two generations and is now such a people can't conceive of science as not being this thing where you submit papers to journals, they go through the peer review process, they have to be reviewed through that whole journal system. That's entrenched itself. And what that's done, I look at that and I see Goodhart's law everywhere. When something, the measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure. like philosophers used to hang out and talk, I think, more than what they're like. Basically, the incentives now are published in the top philosophy journals. And I see like on blog posts, people are like, hey, my paper got rejected from the top 2 or 3 journals in my specialization. Should I put it in like a lower tier journal? And some of the advice is, well, if you want to be an R1, they're going to look down on that. Like, don't even publish your work unless it's in a prestigious journal. So like, we're not, what our goal isn't to disseminate information. Our choices of publication are actually centered on career advancement. There seems to be something that seems to be really bad to me. And I'm wondering, just the whole apparatus in place. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts or insights on that sort of publication system where everything is grafted onto the journal system and how that could affect the sociology of philosophy, what gets published, how people work, what they choose to write, all that.
Yeah, I mean, I think essentially your diagnosis is correct. I think it's a kind of good-hearting. So the profession has good-hearted itself into that, right? You hear these stories by John McDowell or Jonathan Dancy, how they got a permanent job, and they don't even have a PhD and they had no publications, right, in the 70s or earlier.
Perfect, too.
Yeah, I think for a while this was like you had to be like that, like Michael Dummett and Parfit, Dancy, McDowell, and a bunch of others. It was almost like looked down upon to even like have a degree because you had like your genius had to be so indisputable that people would just give you a job, right? Now I think this is total like mythology, but I mean it's true that this happened, but it's total self-mythologizing. But I think that happened for a while, and it escalated in the direction that you described. And 10 years from now, you're going to need like 5 publications to even study philosophy, right? And indeed, you're right. It's very strange to say don't publish that because it's going to hurt your chances. Because, well, if it's it's perverse, right? To not disseminate the stuff that you wrote because it didn't get into the top 5 journals, because that may hurt your chances because it has a weird like halo effect on the perception of your CV. It's very strange, and I think again I said that you can recognize that research programs are dying when they turn meta, and it's a little bit with these things as well, because when you look at the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science, much of it is now on peer review in philosophy. Right, there are journal articles doing social epistemology of peer review, right, putting these 2 trends together, and they sort of look at, does it improve the profession, right? And you see, like, there must be something very seriously wrong with this peer review system when people start going meta and talking about it in philosophy journals, right? So there are cracks in the system. And I think it's probably just like a sociological phenomenon in itself. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, there were increasingly more people that went to university. It's a pretty attractive job to have an academic employment, right? It's interesting. I mean, you don't get rich, but it has lots of pros, lots of benefits. So it's always going to be more attractive to. Always going to be attractive to more people than there are jobs. Competition intensifies, and then people kind of like double down on the things that they have at their disposal to sort between people in that competition, right? And you have pedigree, you have journal publications, exactly the kind of stuff that we are seeing, in order to decide who can be employed academically. And that system, I think, is. I mean, the direction of that system isn't really sustainable. Now, I'm increasingly reluctant to subject myself to that kind of humiliation of peer review. I'm glad that I don't really have to. I'm not trying to generally dunk on it, because I think that I can give you a couple of papers of mine where you can compare the published version that went through peer review and the version that I first submitted, and it really became much, much, much improved. So there is that too, right? But I think the system as it currently operates is probably going to have to be renegotiated. at some point, not too far in the future.
Yeah, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Given how things are going, there's been all these people may not know about like the drama of publishers putting pressure on the editors at journals to do certain things. The editors refuse. The journal shuts down. They start new journals. There's been basically wars between editors and editorial boards and publishers, and often the philosophical community. I think this is with political philosophy that this happened, was one of the more prominent ones. But there's still like, when I publish papers, my dad is asking me like, well, how much are you getting paid? And I'm like, no, I don't get any money for publishing. It's not how it works. But also peer reviewers typically don't get paid. So, there's some publishers, it makes all the profit off of charging exorbitant fees to universities for institutional access. And then the people actually doing most of the work, the actual reviews, we get nothing or we get peanuts for doing this. I'm not saying hand over the money. I'm saying like, how did we get in a position where it's like if I managed people to go like mow people's lawns and then like they don't get paid, I get all of the money. And I might even tell them you have to bring your own equipment. Like that's a bizarre structure to have in place, and somehow that got put in place. Very, very weird.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the business model is insane, and I don't. Maybe it's different in the US, but in the Netherlands, we have open access agreements with basically every journal, and so we are paying them 4,000 euros for publishing.
Yeah.
Right, because we agreed to that. Right, so every time I publish a silly little article that will be read by 9 people, my university, and by extension, the Dutch taxpayer, is paying 4,000 euros to Taylor and Francis or Springer for publishing that paper, and it's just insane. It's a great business model. I wish I had invented it, but it's stupid.
It's really insane. I mean, this is the publisher. Their job is to present and make the material available to people. And what they do is, hey, give it to us. We own it. Now, we'll share it with people, but you have to pay us money. What? So their job is to hold your work hostage. It's like the opposite of the intended purpose. It's not dissemination. It's actually gatekeeping, and that is just mind blowing. And I saw an article recently of a person talking about how like policymakers often don't have access to published research. Might not have. I don't know what like the federal government has access to, but if a lot of people, let's say, even if you're a federal employee that does have some sort of access to scientific journals that could inform policymaking, you might have interns or employees that may or may not have access, and you might want to have some of them help out with the research, and they don't have. So just too bad. Paywalls everywhere. The whole paywalling thing is just absolutely wild to me. And it's like, no, you can get around that. Just cough up money. What? There's something weird about this. There's something that's not right about it. And I worry that it's harming society. Like, it's not good to take all of the stuff that we do and silo it and hide it away and then hold it hostage to having some sort of institutional act. Like, so what if a person is a brilliant independent researcher? The only way for them to access journals is to pirate them. That's the only way. Because what are they going to do? Pay $40 per article? That's insane. It's not like Spotify where I could pay some monthly fee, which might not even be fair to musicians. Maybe the fee should be more, or maybe they should get a bigger cut. But like, if I could get a $10 a month subscription, it gives me access to like all of the articles from a particular publisher. I think people might pay that, but no, it's like $40. It's not. Do people actually pay these fees? I'm assuming some people once in a while do, but the fees look more like screw you can't have it. They look more like that.
It's a very interesting question. How many people buy single articles? I would love to know that. Yeah, when you like you said, like this is $45 for this article on epistemic insouciance. Who's paying that? I would love to hear that.
Yeah, I don't know. But something's not right with this. Okay, so we've gotten pretty far along in this conversation, and I really want to ask questions about metaethics and talk about that. But I feel like we should table that for another discussion if you'd be up for that.
Yeah. We can do another time.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I know we don't want to get Joe Rogan here and go 3-4 hours. So
Yeah, I mean,
maybe this is a good point to start wrapping things up.
I mean, in fact, I would like to. Would like to look after my daughters who are upstairs, and I don't think they expected me to be down here so long. But I'm happy to come on a second time and then talk about. I mean, it was fun. It was interesting, but it was mostly about sort of like the state of the business, which I like. But we can, if we want to do a thing on meta ethics, let's do it.
That sounds good. Okay, so I will put some links to whatever you want me to, like your website or whatever, your book or whatever. Can you tell us the name of that book that you mentioned earlier again?
Yeah, it's called The Invention of Good and Evil, A World History of Morality. And in the US, it came out from Oxford University Press. In the UK, from Profile Books. And if you're in Canada, it's Simon & Schuster.
Awesome.
And they all look different. So if you find a book with that title, it has different covers depending on where it came out, but it's always the same book.
Cool. Okay, so people will know where to find your stuff in the description for this video. So thanks for being on here. I'm sure we'll talk another time. We'll talk maybe about
Yeah. It was really fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And so everybody, if you can do the standard thing, I'll play the outro video, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see everybody later. Take care.